A sign in with Google button, a sign in with Facebook button, a sign in with Amazon button, a sign in with Microsoft button. A lot of these large tech giants have kind of consolidated power over identity for many years now, but they've also provided a very good service in the meantime. And I think besides, well, first I'll introduce myself. Like I said earlier, I'm a co-founder of Spruce. I'm one of the co-authors on a specification called Sign In with Ethereum. At Spruce, we build a lot of open source libraries around Sign In with Ethereum, and personally want to give users control over their identity and data. And going back, I think one of the first questions to answer is, how exactly did we get here? And I think the first step in the entire process as the web was forming was death by 1,000 passwords. When users wanted to first log into sites and services, every site or service had a different way of authenticating you, a different account that you had at each service, and a different password to remember for each one. Shortly after, a bunch of folks got together and specified what's known as OpenID Connect, or OIDC, which kind of looked to solve that million password problem, giving users rather the choice of choosing their own identity provider and letting applications verify the identity of a user in the process. And this was bundled with something called OAuth 2, which also didn't just let the authentication happen, but also allowed some authorizations to happen. So you can think of this sometimes when you're signing in with Google and the site or service also wants to access some additional information on your behalf that may be linked to a Google account, for example. Now, what this ultimately ended up leading towards was the NASCAR problem. Although users were able to basically choose their identity providers, at the same time we ended up with websites that kind of looked like this. Basically, a large number of tech giants ultimately ended up sweeping up becoming the identity provider of choice because as users, these were sites and services that we used all the time. We all mostly have Google accounts, we all mostly have Amazon accounts, we all mostly have Facebook accounts. So as soon as we saw that button, it was very easy to relinquish that control and say, hey, I'm going to log in using that account instead of something that I control, or at least an identifier that I have a little more control over, and kind of go through this passwordless login flow because I want to sign in using my Google or Microsoft account. So ultimately, we all consolidated across a number of different providers that all wanted to be there when you wanted to log into a site or service. Namely, the incentives ended up being a little mixed. With a lot of third parties that you were signing into, they sometimes may have been asking for more scopes than originally intended. So wanting to know a little too much about what's in your Google Drive, or wanting to know a little too much about your Google contacts, or wanting to know a little bit too much about your Facebook social graph. So starting to dig in a little more on the information side for users, and users kind of relinquishing this information in favor of convenience. And the second thing is, it became an even bigger gravity well for large tech companies that wanted you to sign in using their identifiers because it ultimately led back to a link to their services. Now, the question is, how can we stop this? And I'm not going to say that these identity providers were like doing evil from the start, but rather they provided an excellent service. I can't tell you how many times I've personally signed in with Google or signed in with Facebook or signed in with Amazon because it was there for me when I needed it. It became a lot easier than using passwords in the process. But it is in fact possible, especially with users controlling their own identifiers, especially with users with wallets, especially with users with key pairs, to move towards systems where users in fact do control their identity, do control their identifiers, and do control their data. It is in fact possible. And we can move towards this model of not your keys, not your crypto, which we ultimately talk about, to not your keys, not your identifier or your identity in the process. Because those keys at the end of the day that you're using for all these transactions using your wallets are keys in fact that you control. It's an identifier that you control. For example, if Google were to ever pull the rug on you, you wouldn't just lose access to services you signed into Google with. You would also lose access to Google services and kind of everything in between. With an Ethereum account, you are ultimately at the root of control with those keys. And thus, Sign In with Ethereum was born. And a big part of it was a standardization effort where we defined a common signing format for wallets to authenticate with dApps. And it was a standard that was initially pushed by the Ethereum Foundation and ENS in combination with us over at Spruce, and specifying it was the first step in the process, but really encapsulating this idea of your keys, your identifier, and defining a standard way for Ethereum accounts to log in to sites and services. Now, this became a big step because in the dApp world, you had a lot of sites and services that may establish a session with a user on a back end and required some kind of signing flow. So OpenSea is a good example of this. If you've ever used OpenSea, you can go in, you could connect a wallet, you could send some blockchain transactions, but the second you wanted to edit your profile, they'll typically make you sign a message. and this message in your wallet says, hey, you're signing into OpenSea, click the sign button and we'll be good at the end of this. And a number of other dApps started using similar processes with different signing messages. So some dApps would say, hey, sign the magic message, and all of a sudden you're logged in. Some dApps would give you like a bunch of letters and numbers to sign and say, great, now you're logged into the service. And what Sign with Ethereum did was basically standardize that format. So you as a user know, hey, I'm actually signing into the site or service when you're using your wallet to actually sign in and start that session with that dApp. Now, it's kind of the first step in the entire process. It's letting users sign in. But the other thing that this kind of traditional identity thing did was it allowed users to bring some data with them to sessions. So apps and services would have things like an email. Apps and services would have some things like basic profile information that would come from a Google account, that would come from an Amazon account, that would come from a Facebook account. A lot of the work that we're doing now really is trying to unbundle a lot of these large pieces of this and reconstruct it where the user is in control using their Ethereum account. And my co-founder Wayne kind of dubbed this unbundling the login. How do we take all these pieces and put it back together with the user in control rather than large tech giants? And a lot of our work right now is focused on, it was initially focused on signing with Ethereum, but the second part we're focused on now is how do you get to that second part where a user is in fact bringing their data to an application that they control rather than kind of logging in with an existing tech giant and maybe kind of bringing their data with them and the site or service kind of keeping the data on their behalf. So currently, we're working on that second part right now, which is enabling users to control their data across the web with something we're calling recaps. And what these are called capability authorizations. So you can think of it almost like a hall pass. So if a site or service wants to access something on my behalf, I could write them the equivalent of like a hall pass, like you could do this thing. That site or service would then countersign that and present it to you in order to like retrieve data from a data vault or credentials you have stored somewhere. So in fact, the user can not only log in using their Ethereum account, but also bring pieces of them with them across the way and consent to everything across the way, which is a big part of the standardization effort. Now, a big part of this too was also not leaving anyone behind in the process. It's all great that a lot of us are in fact users of key pairs. We all have wallets in some way or another. If you're here, more than likely, I'll say, there are some folks here who are new to this. But part of it was also making sure that there are sites and services in the traditional side that still use kind of OAuth logins that can in fact integrate this kind of stuff. So some of our work is also focused on how do we enable sites with these traditional login flows to also enable flows like sign-in with Ethereum. So we've collaborated with folks like Auth0 to integrate these workflows. So if you do have these traditional workflows as a large tech company, you're also able to kind of integrate this as well and kind of bring users along the way or kind of get users just started on signing in with Ethereum once they're comfortable to do so while still offering a couple of other options. The question is now how you can help. It is in fact possible. So if you are a developer, some of the best ways of getting this stuff off the ground is trying out libraries around sign-in with Ethereum, starting to get users, signing in using their Ethereum keys. We work on a number of open source libraries. There are other companies in the space also working on libraries around letting users sign in using their Ethereum keys. And honestly, that's the first step in this entire process. If you want users truly controlling their identity and data, it all starts with the first step when they're actually signing into sites and services using their keys. So for consumers, a lot of it deals specifically with asking sites and services, hey, can I in fact sign in with my Ethereum account? For developers, it's, hey, how can I enable this flow on my site? And slowly growing that more and more, not just in the Web3 space, but also in the Web2 space. Asking sites and services, can we in fact do this and enable this for users? And part of it too is we work on a lot of open source software at Spruce. We're more than happy to help any developers along the way and really would love to get more people involved, more people learning about these standards, more people participating in the standards process and starting to use these libraries and workflows. So thanks. I'm Rocco from Spruce and hope to talk to some of you soon.